I hope you've enjoyed this DVD. It's been a pretty massive journey yet again. Huge amount of ground covered, I think. We've moved on our skills quite a lot, I think, in this DVD. In the first DVD in the series, we were looking at basic skills, navigating around the viewport, grabbing objects, getting primitives, putting primitives together to create basic looking models, using modifiers, space warps, things like that. And in this DVD, we've looked at mesh editing and joining meshes together, creating faces from scratch, subdividing faces, extruding. We've moved on a great deal, I think. In chapter one, we looked at edit meshes, how they were built up, what are the different sub elements, vertices, edges, so on and so forth. In chapter two, we looked at actually creating faces for the first time. We lay down some vertices, joined them together using edges, and for the first time we actually created some mesh, as it were, almost like out of thin air. Then in the next chapter, we went on and we got two distinct meshes and we attached them together to create a single mesh. We looked at how we could then detach those two apart again, how we could detach parts, subparts of a mesh into elements, and so on and so forth. So that was a kind of breaking and welding chapter where we looked at how we could tackle those two topics. Then we looked at soft selections, and this is not something specific to edit meshes. These are also present in edit polys and other areas of Max, and it's a really great feature. It's something, if you've ever used Maya, it's still sorely missing in Maya even today. Maya has a soft selection tool, but the way it's been implemented is awkward, and you kind of have to create a soft selection explicitly. You can't really create them on the fly in the same way as you can in 3ds Max. Having soft selections is invaluable when you're doing modeling. So that's something to be aware of when you're working with edit meshes and edit polys. Then we looked at something which is a little bit more of a kind of drudge, but something you really need to be aware of is smoothing groups. How you can define groups so that they smooth together, so you get this continuous smooth shading at render time. This is something which is very often an automatic thing. When you create your primitives, the smoothing groups will be automatically defined for you by 3ds Max. It's kind of implicit in the way the surfaces are built. If you've got a cube, there'll be 6 smoothing groups, one for each face of the cube. If you've got a cylinder, there'll be 3 smoothing groups. One smoothing group for the end of the cylinder, another smoothing group for the other end of the cylinder, and another smoothing group for the side. If you've got a cone, there'll be 2 smoothing groups, one for the sides of the cone itself, and one for the base of the cone. So that's implicit smoothing groups. But when you're mesh editing, very often smoothing groups aren't implicit. That you're creating a mesh from scratch, and therefore you need to understand exactly how smoothing groups work so that you can actually assign your own smoothing groups in that kind of circumstance. Then we moved on and we looked at edit polys. What is it, that makes an edit poly unique? What are the sub elements? Again, we've got vertices, edges, but this time we have polygons, true polygons, rather than just triangular faces. We had the new element type, which was the border, and I just basically run through there. What is it that makes edit poly unique and distinct from edit mesh? Why is it so important for doing sub-D modeling? And then we moved on, and I looked at the whole reason for having edit poly, which is to have edge rings and loops, so we can actually select rings of edges and then connect them together, subdivide them. Therefore, doing sub-D modeling, which is the whole reason for having edit poly in 3ds Max. So very important that we quickly looked at that. Then we moved on to our go-kart project, and then in 3 chapters we basically built the frame. In the first chapter we got the frame organized and set ourselves up. Then we built the bottom part of the frame. In the next chapter we built the top part of the frame, tackled some slightly more difficult areas of the model. And then in the third chapter we went through all of the different areas of the model and we rounded off corners, added beveling, and just basically enhanced the model and took it to another level, improved the look of it substantially, I think you'll agree. And, we carried on a theme which we looked at in the first DVD, which is that, if you're going to use primitives, then at least use bevel primitives if you can. And I think I actually mentioned in the first DVD that some of the elements in our model do not come with an automatic bevel. For instance, tubes, they don't have a bevel feature built in. So you could actually add the bevel manually. We didn't actually do that in this DVD. We'll actually tackle that in the fourth DVD in the series. And in that DVD, we'll go in and clean up lots of different areas and finesse the entire model once we've got it all put together. But it shows you that you can actually go in and put in bevels wherever you really want to with mesh modeling. So you've really got total creative freedom in that respect. And then we wrapped up the DVD in a couple of chapters that we've just looked at. Well, I just went through, basic modeling tips, a grab bag of tips that are non-specific really to mesh editing, but I thought it was important that halfway through the series that we quickly look at some basic tips that are important for everything, every element of modeling. It doesn't have to be a sub-D workflow or a spline workflow or mesh or just working with primitives. These are the kind of things that apply to everything. So we looked at basic tips in the first chapter in that section, and then we looked at organizational techniques, things like using layers, sub-object selection sets, and so on and so forth, so that we could keep ourselves organized and make sure that when we tackle a modeling project, we're not going to kind of go at it in a kind of random manner. It's very important when you're modeling that you're very organized. If you can imagine, if you're going to create a complex model of, let's say, a steam train, which is something that we look at in one of our advanced titles, which was actually modeled by myself, you almost have to treat it like you're really going to build a steam train. It's like building a car. You'd have to put everything down in front of you. Everything would have to be labeled. You'd have to really know what each part is that you're going to be building. When you build a model of that complexity, you don't just go at it, willy-nilly, because you'll reach a certain point in building the model and you'll just have no idea what's going on. It'll just be chaos. It'll be a mess. So it's really important that you are organized, especially in technical projects, and you use some of the tips and best practices that I mentioned in the last chapter in that section to help you keep that organization going. I think that basically brings us to the end of this DVD, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed recording it. And what we're going to be looking at in the next DVD is a different subject, really, from something that we've been looking at so far. We'll be looking at modeling using curves. And these tools actually are very old because they were in, very similar versions of them were in 3D Studio, the progenitor of 3D Studio Max. Therefore, they're something that I'm very familiar with. These days, some people don't use them as much as they once did, but splines, curves, they're a very important tool, and especially when you're working in architecture, because it gives you a kind of procedural way of building your mesh. You define a curve and you can then define another curve. By using those two curves, you can produce a surface. And that surface is built up of polygons, as we've mentioned in the first DVD in the series. Basically everything at the end of the day is made up of polygons. But the really nice thing about that system is that if you change the curve, the surface will redefine itself, and it'll even build itself out of a different array of polygons. So you'll end up with a different surface. But the point is, it's very easy to change that curve, and you get a nice, accurate, sort of mathematically correct surface from that result. So it's very much suitable for building walls, mechanical parts of objects, things like axles, wine glasses, using the lathe tool. And also for producing sort of extrusions, tubes of a particular shape that form into very curvilinear shapes. So anyway, we'll be looking at that in the next DVD. There's no point in me going on about it anymore now. I'll hopefully see you there. In the meantime, enjoy some mesh editing, experiment with what I've shown you in this DVD, and when you're ready, I'll hopefully see you in DVD 3. Bye for now.